Welcome to the historic city of Oxford, world famous as the home of the oldest university in the English-speaking world. Dominated by the academic institution for over 900 years, Oxford has evolved into one of the most active and beautiful cities in the UK, filled with history every step of the way. On this 50-minute tour of Oxford's city centre, we'll uncover the city's many landmarks and marvellous history. However, we of course begin with the University of Oxford. We're standing before Christ Church, one of the largest of the university's 39 colleges, founded in 1546 by none other than King Henry VIII. Although it was established some 450 years after the university, Christ Church has grown to become one of Oxford's most famous colleges. Surrounded by marvellous gardens, the college is today home to around 600 students, and is also notable for the many famous names that have studied here over the centuries. Some of these names include Lewis Carroll, writer of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Albert Einstein, the legendary physicist who briefly studied at the college in the 1930s, and even King Edward VII himself. However, Christ Church is perhaps best known for producing 13 of the United Kingdom's former Prime Ministers. That's the highest number for any single college at Oxford, and nearly half of the 28 former students of this university who went on to govern the country. But there's more to this historic college than its long roll of renowned students, as it's actually home to one of the smallest cathedrals in Britain. Looking across these resplendent gardens, we can see Christ Church Cathedral, from which the college takes its name. Before the college was established, this was the site of a medieval priory founded in the year 1122. At the centre of the priory was a church, but in 1522 it was taken over by the powerful Cardinal Wolsey, who established his own college here. A few years later, and after Wolsey fell from power, King Henry VIII took it over, and established the college we know today, with the cathedral uniquely serving as the college chapel. The cathedral also sits just beside the Great Quadrangle, better known as the Tom Quad, which is positioned at the heart of Christ Church, here on the southern side of Oxford city centre. And just over a century after the college was founded, the Great Hall of the cathedral also played host to England's national parliament, as King Charles I effectively made Oxford his wartime capital in the early stages of the English Civil War. Parliament sat here in Oxford from 1644 to 1645, but not much is known of what unfolded inside, as the records of the Oxford Parliament were mainly destroyed when the city was captured by Oliver Cromwell's forces in 1646. Now out of the college gardens, across the street from us we can see a shop that was originally built in the 15th century, and which is today popularly known as Alice's shop, as it served as the inspiration for a chapter in Lewis Carroll's sequel to Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass. In the book, this is the Old Sheep Shop, a small haberdashery run by an old sheep, who may have been inspired by an old lady that stood behind the till in real life. On this side of the looking glass, the shop was a sweet shop, which the real Alice is said to have visited during her childhood. And it's here in Oxford where the real Alice once lived. Her name was Alice Liddell, the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, while Lewis Carroll was living and studying here. You'll find all manner of places around Oxford which inspired Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but as we now walk up past Christ Church Cathedral once again, it's about time that we had a look at where you'd find this magnificent city on a map. As you can see, Oxford, the county town of Oxfordshire, is located in the heart of southern England, and distanced roughly 60 miles away from each of the cities of London, Birmingham and Bristol. That central and highly accessible location has long played a role in Oxford's development as one of Britain's great cities, home to spectacular architecture and history, just a tiny bit of which we'll be able to explore on this walk of the city. Having walked up the road from Alice's shop, we now find ourselves beside one of the most famous parts of Christ Church, the Great Quadrangle, or as it's better known nowadays, the Tom Quad. The Quad, a large courtyard surrounded by college buildings, takes its name from the tower that we can see here, the Tom Tower. Built in 1682 and designed by Christopher Wren, the architect behind St Paul's Cathedral in London, the Tom Tower is more than just a gateway to the Quad inside, also housing the loudest bell in Oxford, Great Tom. Much like Big Ben in London, Great Tom is the nickname for the bell inside the tower. Every night at 9:05, the bell rings out 101 times, a number that signifies the original 100 scholars at the time of Christ Church's founding, plus an extra guy who turned up about 120 years later. Across the street from the Tom Tower, we find the comparably small St Aldate's Church. The church, which has origins dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period, today stands as a Victorian rebuild, and one of the many churches that stand alongside the university buildings in dominating central Oxford. Today, Oxford is often called the City of Dreaming Spires, a nickname that arises from the city's skyline of elegant churches and ornate college buildings, which are without doubt the biggest appeal on any visit to the city. We're now continuing along St Aldate's, the road taking its name from the parish church we just walked by. The road leads us past the wonderful buildings of Christ Church's Tom Quad into the busy city centre, which you might have noticed is absolutely filled with buses, but not too many cars. That's because Oxford is notoriously difficult to drive into, with a number of restrictions and charges for cars that drive into the city centre. If you are visiting Oxford by car, there are a bunch of park and ride facilities on the edge of the city, allowing you to hop on the bus into its bustling centre. Looking past one of Oxford's many double-decker buses, we can see the Grand Town Hall, built in 1897. Today doubling as the home of the local council and one of the city's main events venues, the Town Hall is a magnificent building that overlooks the very centre of Oxford. And that brings us to the origins of this world-famous city, which existed long before the university was established. Oxford was originally settled by the Anglo-Saxons, who named it Oxnaford, simply meaning a ford or river crossing for oxen. At the time, Oxford wasn't the renowned settlement it is today, and it was in fact burned to the ground on 2 separate occasions by the Vikings, who at the time controlled vast swathes of English territory. Relatively little is known of Oxford before the Normans arrived in the late 11th century, but they established a castle, which began to see the city's star rise, before the university followed soon after. We now find ourselves on Carfax, the crossroads that mark the centre point of Oxford, and where you'll also find the 13th century Carfax Tower, a symbol of the city. Once part of the long since demolished St Martin's Church, Carfax Tower stands a modest 74 feet or 23 metres tall, and is meant to be the tallest building in Oxford. The tower serves as a lookout across the city, and according to local law, no other building is allowed to be built higher than it. But that rule has been broken on a few occasions in recent years, though the view from atop Carfax Tower across Oxford remains protected. From the city's central crossroads, we're now going to make our way along Oxford High Street, a spectacular thoroughfare that gently curves its way past a number of university colleges, and is home to a number of grand buildings of its own. Before we take a look at those landmarks though, let's look back in time to the period just after the Normans arrived in Oxford, when it's believed that the university was first born. Details are sketchy, but it's thought that academic teaching was taking place here in Oxford as long ago as the year 1096. Initially a fairly small-scale operation, the University of Oxford began to develop rapidly from 1167, when the then King Henry II banned English students from attending the University of Paris, which is thought to predate Oxford by just a few decades. With students now unable to study abroad, Oxford became the foremost centre of learning in England, giving rise to a huge development that saw the academic institution come to dominate the medieval town. But the emergence of the university wasn't without controversy, and disquiet among locals ultimately led to the founding of Oxford's long-standing university rival, Cambridge. As we look up at Oxford's covered market hall, built in the 1770s, a little later on we'll pick up the story of how the rise of the university continued through time. Continuing along the High Street now, across the road we can see an example of how the university has come to occupy almost every corner of the modern city. This is the former All Saints Church, which has a history dating back to the early 12th century. This is a rebuild dating from the early 18th century, and it was once the official city church of Oxford. However, since 1975, the historic church now serves as the library for Lincoln College, founded in 1427, and which occupies many of the buildings across the street from us. Next door to Lincoln College is Brasenose College, founded in 1509, and which has an equally illustrious history in Oxford. Standing on the site of the medieval Brasenose Hall, the college is said to take its name from a brass, nose-shaped door knocker that once adorned it. Brasenose, which has produced students including Magpie Lane and former Prime Minister David Cameron, is also known as the home of one of the world's oldest rowing clubs, having participated and won the world's first modern rowing race in 1815 against Jesus College, also of Oxford. Here we're passing the elegant facade of Brasenose College, but just along the street we can see the spire of the University Church of St Mary the Virgin, the largest parish church in Oxford. Centrally located in both the city and the university sphere, the church has long been an important site in the city centre. Much of the current church dates from the 13th century, and is considered by some to be the first building of the University of Oxford. Later on in history, it was also the site of the trial of the Oxford Martyrs, who we'll talk about later, and until the 17th century, it hosted graduation ceremonies for students. Without doubt one of the most beautiful buildings in the city, the church also overlooks the Radcliffe Camera, one of the symbols of the modern university. We'll visit the Radcliffe Camera in a little while, but let's now head off the High Street and down the seemingly innocently named Magpie Lane. Overlooked by dreaming spires at both ends, this quaint medieval alleyway takes its name from an alehouse that once stood on the lane. However, that wasn't the first name that the lane was known by. As one of England's liveliest and most thriving cities in the medieval period, Oxford was home to all manner of industries. Before the 17th century, Magpie Lane was locally known as a place where prostitutes operated, and it was originally named, do excuse my language here, Grope Lane. That name was actually fairly commonplace across England in the medieval period for the same reasons, although later on in history, the name of this lane was adapted to be known as Grove Street, before it regained the name Magpie Lane in 1927. Magpie Lane is today a far calmer little thoroughfare in the centre of town, and it's also surrounded by some of the oldest colleges in the University of Oxford. To our right is Balliol College, established in 1324, and to our left are parts of Corpus Christi College, dating to 1517, and University College, which claims to be the university's oldest college of all, having been founded back in 1249. And as we now reach the end of Magpie Lane, we can see Merton College, another of the University of Oxford's three oldest colleges. Merton is also the largest college in this densely packed university area, and it was founded in 1264 here on the quiet Merton Street. Of course, the street, which runs roughly parallel to the High Street, takes its name from Merton College, but further down in this direction there's also the main part of Corpus Christi College, while a walk through the Black Gate will take you back towards Christ Church, where we began our walk. Here, though, we're looking up at the splendid chapel of Merton College, complete with its iconic Gothic tower that dates from 1450. The inside of the chapel is also among the oldest and best preserved in England, built in the 13th century, and having survived much of the religious turmoil of the English Reformation, which saw many splendid historic churches altered forever in the 16th century. As we mentioned, the wonderfully cobbled Merton Street here is surrounded by colleges on all sides. But why exactly is Oxford home to so many colleges? And more fundamentally, why is the university split into different colleges? Well, the answer takes us all the way back to the very birth of the University of Oxford. Earlier we mentioned that the university dates back to around 1096, when small-scale teaching took place here. However, after King Henry II banned students from studying in Paris in 1167, Oxford began to develop rapidly. But it would still be another 82 years before a college was founded. The groundwork for magnificent colleges like Merton before us here was laid in the 13th century, after the University of Oxford was granted official recognition by way of a royal charter in 1248. However, by this point, the university had already begun to take over much of local life, with students living all over Oxford. Over time, frictions arose between locals and students, a dispute often known as town and gown, which prompted the building of independent halls of residence for students. Initially, these were simply places for students to live, but they soon grew into separate colleges, with distinct, proud identities, and which all students of the university aspired to belong to. Merton College, although possibly not the first in the university, is considered to have set the benchmark for all colleges in Oxford. Its founder, Walter de Merton, wrote a series of statutes, effectively a constitution that set out rules for the students that belonged to his college to follow. The idea of college statutes turned colleges from simple dormitories into self-governing communities of their own, and which appealed to different students. To this day, most students choose to apply to individual colleges, a custom which has taken place since the very first colleges were founded. Initially, many students grouped themselves into colleges that linked up roughly with where they were from. There were colleges which were generally made up of students from the south of England, while others were composed largely of northerners and people from Scotland. Over time, the diversity of college populations evolved, giving each college its own recognizable identity, coming with its own coat of arms, and countless unique traditions that have endured through the centuries. Take Merton College, for example. Of the college's many traditions, one of the most well-known, and most recent, is the time ceremony, which has taken place every year since 1971, when the clocks changed from British Summer Time to Greenwich Mean Time. According to tradition, Merton students take to the college quad, and walk backwards around it for a whole hour, from 2 AM BST to 2 AM GMT, just to make sure the clocks have changed. And why not? Here, meanwhile, we're passing a rather more serious place, the Grand Examination Schools building, which was opened in 1882. One of the largest university buildings in town, it's where the university organises exams, and where many students take their all-important finals during the so-called Trinity term, or the last term of the academic year. Having wound our way past some of Oxford's most historic colleges on Merton Street, we now find ourselves returning to the busy High Street, which is still home to a number of stories we haven't yet explored. From here, the High Street continues to curve out of central Oxford, where it crosses the Magdalen Bridge, a historic crossing point of the River Cherwell that's also known as a popular place for punting, another Oxford tradition that allows you to enjoy the lovely riverside scenery on a gondola-style boat. We won't walk down to the bridge today, but in front of us we can see Magdalen College, said to be one of the most beautiful of the 39 in Oxford. Founded in 1458, its iconic tower dates back to the Tudor period, and is also the centre point of another Oxford tradition, the May morning. Having taken place for over 500 years, the May morning is one of the university's older traditions, wherein a choir sings a hymn from atop the tower at 6 a.m. on the 1st of May every year. Crowds of thousands of people gather beneath the tower and along the high street here from early in the morning, and the day then proceeds around the centre of the city with various other festivities. It's one of England's most extravagant May Day festivals, and certainly a must for any student at Oxford. To our left now is the daunting high street facade of the examination schools, which isn't only used for exams, but also hosts the university's annual Freshers' Fair, which welcomes new students in the first term of the academic year, also known as Michaelmas term. And that's another interesting quirk of the University of Oxford, that each of its 3 academic terms have specific names. Along with a number of historic schools around the country, these 3 terms are Michaelmas, Hilary, and Trinity, all named after historic religious dates in the calendar that were once used more widely across society to divide the year into sections. Briefly looking off the high street now, we find ourselves on Queen's Lane, named after Queen's College, which is located to our left. Further down the lane we can see one of the oldest churches in Oxford, the 12th century St. Peter in the East, which has now been converted into the library of St. Edmund Hall College, on this side of the lane. St. Edmund Hall, housed inside these buildings on Queen's Lane, is unique as the only college of the university that still retains a medieval academic hall, overlooking the college's compact quad. As we continue past yet more grand university buildings on the high street now, one thing that you might not know about this city is that the University of Oxford isn't the only university in town. Located on a variety of campuses outside the city centre, you'll also find Oxford Brookes University, originally founded as an art school in 1865, but which became a university in 1992, and which has a student population about 3/4 the size of the University of Oxford. With the 2 universities in town, over 25% of Oxford's population today are students, showing us just how significant academic life is here. Of course, there's much more to Oxford than its famous university. Later on in our walk, we'll also see Oxford Castle, monuments to the Oxford Martyrs, locations from the beloved television series Inspector Morse, which was set here in Oxford, and even the place which is said to be the origin for Harry Potter's world-famous scar. Sticking with the university for now though, on our right we're passing All Souls College, one of the strangest colleges in Oxford. Though it occupies a prominent place in the city centre, the college has no undergraduate students. So what's the point of it? Well, the college, which is home to just a handful of postgraduates, functions more as a research institute. This has been the case since the late 17th century, and it's said that All Souls College serves as a reminder that there is more to academia than simply teaching students. The college offers a place for research over instruction, allowing new knowledge to be created, which is then disseminated more widely across the university and the world. They certainly are brainiacs here in Oxford, and take the pursuit of academia very seriously. And as we now leave the high street to walk down Catte Street, we'll see a number of examples of the grand architecture that evokes the local enthusiasm for learning. Up ahead is the world-famous Radcliffe Camera, by many counts the symbol of the University of Oxford today, and which sits at the heart of the academic sphere in the city. The building doesn't belong to any single college, but has a long history as one of Oxford's central libraries. Built in the late 1740s, the Radcliffe Camera was originally an independent library, but it was absorbed into the university in 1927, and it now serves as an additional reading room for the Bodleian, Oxford's main research library. We'll take a look around the Bodleian in a few moments, but from Radcliffe Square here we can see the gorgeous spire of the University Church of St Mary the Virgin, which we passed on the High Street earlier. As we mentioned, the church was once the site of university graduation ceremonies, but in recent years it's taken on a more humble role as a centre for worship and academic and religious learning. Tourists can also visit the inside of the church and even climb to the top of its tower, which offers stunning views across the city. The top of the church tower also offers the best views of the Radcliffe Camera, which takes its name from Dr. John Radcliffe, one of England's most renowned doctors. Originally from Wakefield up in Yorkshire, Radcliffe studied at and graduated from Oxford, before going on to serve as the royal physician to monarchs William III and Mary II. When Radcliffe died in 1714, the terms of his will left much of his property and wealth to charities, while £40,000 was given to the construction of a grand new library in the centre of Oxford, which became the building we see before us today. Though it's still a working library, you can take a guided tour of the Radcliffe Camera's equally ornate interior, but we'll now continue walking along Catte Street towards the northern edge of the historic centre of Oxford. On our left here is the mighty Bodleian Library, one of the oldest working libraries in Europe, and which is made up of a wide range of buildings not just here, but across central Oxford. Like the Radcliffe Camera, it doesn't belong to any one college, and as such houses the widest collection of literature in the city, with over 13 million printed items inside, making it the second largest library in the UK after the British Library in London. Across the road from the library, we find another iconic Oxford landmark, generally known as the Bridge of Sighs, after its shared appearance with the bridge of the same name in Venice. Built in 1914, the bridge is officially named Hertford Bridge, as it links two parts of Hertford College. A story often thrown around when it comes to the bridge is that the university once surveyed the weight of all of its students, and found that Hertford colleges were the heaviest. In response, Hertford decided to close the bridge, and make students walk via the street to get between buildings. In reality, that story isn't true, and a walk via the bridge is in fact more of a faff, owing to the stairs inside. However, the Bridge of Sighs remains a popular tourist attraction in Oxford, just like the buildings that we'll find back across the road from it. Here we find ourselves beside the Bodleian Library, which we'll talk more about in a moment, and looking towards the Sheldonian Theatre on the left, and the Clarendon Building on the right. The Clarendon, opened in 1715, was built as the home of the Oxford University Press, the world's largest university printing press. For around 100 years, the Clarendon Building hosted the printing presses, but after they moved out, it eventually made its way to becoming another part of the enormous Bodleian Library. And so, let's now head into the heart of one of Europe's oldest libraries, which has been in operation since the year 1602. However, the library actually has its origins in the first purpose-built library in Oxford, which was founded in the 13th century. Originally a small collection of university books, the old library existed for around 200 years, before the university stopped funding it. In 1602, however, Sir Thomas Bodley, a former fellow of Merton College, refounded the library, with the building of this stunning courtyard, the old school's Quadrangle, following roughly a decade later. Here in the Quad, we find this statue of the 3rd Earl of Pembroke, who was Chancellor of the University of Oxford from 1617 to 1630. He also founded the university's Pembroke College, and donated greatly to the Bodleian Library here. The door behind him is the main entrance to the old Bodleian Library, which stands opposite to perhaps the most distinctive part of the old school's Quad, the mighty Tower of the Five Orders. So named because it features the 5 orders of classical architecture in its design, at the top of the tower you might be able to see a sculpture of James I, King of England when this quad was built. However, it was James's son, Charles I, who fell foul of a unique rule to do with this library. The Bodleian Library is famously not a lending library. That is, no books can be borrowed from it, but rather read on its premises. It's a rule that the library takes extremely seriously, even refusing King Charles I permission to borrow a book when he was stationed here in 1645. Leaving the old school's quad now, we walk back out to the place in front of the Clarendon Building, which, as we mentioned, is where Oxford University Press was once based. The reason that the Clarendon was built in the first place was because the University Press originally worked in the basement of the building next door, the Sheldonian Theatre. Another of architect Christopher Wren's works, the Sheldonian was built in 1669 as a grand ceremonial hall, which could be used as a separate building for graduations. Those graduations moved out of the University Church to the Sheldonian in the late 17th century. But the University Press, which had begun working in the building's basement, couldn't operate and make noise when the theatre above it was in use. So they moved out of here into the purpose-built Clarendon Building. But over the last 3.5 centuries, the Sheldonian Theatre has retained its use as the venue for grand ceremonies and graduations, with a spectacularly ornate interior reminiscent of the Roman Colosseum. Here's an artistic view of what the theatre looks like on the inside, certainly fitting the bill as the home of Oxford's most important ceremonies and events. Around the back of the Sheldonian Theatre, meanwhile, we can see the imposing Gothic windows of the oldest surviving purpose-built university building in the city, the spectacular Divinity School. It was built in the 14th century as a lecture hall for religious studies, although the building is no longer used for that purpose. Of course, much has changed about Oxford and the university over its centuries of history. But a more recent story can be found in a small mark on the ground beside the Sheldonian Theatre. This mark is simply the signature of a stone cutter, but it's also believed to be the inspiration for the iconic scar on Harry Potter's forehead. The story goes that, when writing the books, author J.K. Rowling had written that a young Harry is scarred by the villainous Voldemort, but Rowling couldn't quite picture how the scar would look. However, on a trip to Oxford, Rowling is said to have seen the mark just outside the Sheldonian here, and the rest, as they say, is history. Walking away from the Sheldonian now, we find ourselves on Broad Street, which is home to another landmark from the world of fiction. The White Horse is one of Oxford's oldest pubs, dating back to 1591, but it's best known today as one of the favoured watering holes of the TV detective Inspector Morse, who starred in the ITV show of the same name. Based on the character in the books by Colin Dexter, Morse is a member of the Oxford Constabulary, and a man of refined tastes, being a lover of opera, poetry, art, and a good pint. When the programme was on TV from 1987 until the year 2000, locations around Oxford were used extensively for filming, and so fans of the show will be delighted to find a lot of Morse references around the city. Walking along Broad Street now, we find ourselves on a road that once existed just outside medieval Oxford. Across the road from where we are, there once stood part of Oxford's city walls, originally built to protect the burgeoning town from outside attack. Little of the walls on this northern side of Oxford remain today, although we'll see part of the old defences when we visit the castle at the end of our walk in about 15 minutes' time. Continuing along Broad Street, to our right is another of the oldest colleges in Oxford, Balliol College, which was founded back in 1263. It's another college which has produced a number of famous figures, including 4 British Prime Ministers, H. Asquith, Harold Macmillan, Edward Heath, and more recently, Boris Johnson. The college has occupied the same site for the last 759 years, and has seen some of the most significant events in Oxford's history unfold right on its doorstep. In the mid-16th century, after the establishment of the Protestant Church of England under King Henry VIII, his daughter, Mary I, ascended to the throne. However, Mary, a devout Catholic, was determined to reverse her father's reforms, and set about it through violent persecution of Protestants. Here in Oxford, 3 Protestant bishops were tried at the University Church in 1555, and were then burnt at the stake at this point on Broad Street. They became known as the Oxford Martyrs, and the death of the 3 men, one of them having been Thomas Cranmer, the acting Archbishop of Canterbury, served as a major flashpoint during Queen Mary's turbulent reign. Like the rest of Broad Street, the site of the martyrs' execution took place just outside the historic city walls, the first of which were built the best part of 1,000 years ago, during the Anglo-Saxon period. A few steps away from here was the old Northgate of the walls, but just outside, the Saxon settlers of what was then Oxford built a small wooden church, which evolved over time into the building that we can see hiding among the leaves here, the Church of St. Mary Magdalene. The current church at its oldest dates to the late 12th century, but of interest is the way that its name is pronounced. Dedicated to Mary Magdalene, a companion of Jesus, the church's name is in contrast to the pronunciation of Magdalen College, which we saw earlier, and which is named after the same person. So why are the two pronounced differently? Well, the pronunciation when the church was built was generally Magdalen, but when Magdalen College was founded a few centuries later, the common pronunciation had become Magdalen. The original way to say it, Magdalen, later became commonplace again, but Magdalen College kept its distinctive pronunciation, giving us the headache we have today. If you're still with me after all that, we've now made our way to what you might call the edge of Oxford's modern city centre. Though we're now a good few hundred feet outside the old walls, we find ourselves beside a defining landmark of the city centre today, the Martyrs Memorial. As the name suggests, the memorial is dedicated to the Oxford Martyrs, although it was actually erected in 1843, nearly 300 years after the martyrs' execution. A magnificent sculpture, the memorial looks almost like the spire of an underground church poking through the pavement. But no matter who tells you that it actually is one of those, don't believe that. Past the memorial, in front of us we can see the grand Randolph Hotel, one of the most prestigious sites in Oxford, and which stands on Beaumont Street, a beautiful Georgian terraced road that was once the site of the medieval Beaumont Palace down the end of the road. Beaumont Palace was the site of the birth of 2 kings of England, Richard I and John, but their birthplace has now been long since demolished. In its place is this elegant city centre thoroughfare, which is also home to the Ashmolean Museum across the road from us here. The museum, founded in 1683, was the first public museum to be built in Britain, originally made as a place to exhibit a collection of curiosities, including coins, books, engravings, and the stuffed body of the last dodo seen in Europe. The curiosities were a donation to the University of Oxford by one Elias Ashmole, after whom the Ashmolean Museum is named. Here on this side of the road, we can see the grand frontage of the Randolph Hotel, built in the Victorian era, and which is another site in Oxford that starred regularly in Inspector Morse. In tribute, the hotel today now houses its own Morse Bar, another interesting spot for fans of the show. Looking back towards Balliol College and the Martyrs Memorial, we now find ourselves on, let me just check my notes, Magdalene Street, which leads back towards the very centre of Oxford and the Carfax crossroads. This lively street of course takes its name from the church that stands beside, and has historically served as the main route into Oxford from the north, with the old Northgate of the city walls once located further along the street. Today, Magdalene Street makes up one of a handful of modern shopping streets in Oxford city centre. Up ahead are the pedestrianised Cornmarket Street and Queen Street, both of which now serve as the busiest parts of the city's modern retail sphere, and where there's a lot of shopping to be done and a lot of history to be seen. You'll have noticed, however, that there's a lot less university presence in this part of the city. While you will find colleges beyond the historic university core around the Bodleian Library and High Street, this part of Oxford has always been more commercially minded. However, when we get back down towards Carfax, we'll see how the busy lives of locals clashed with university students, a conflict which erupted into violent and hugely significant rioting across the city centre in the early 14th century. We've now made our way onto the pedestrianised Cornmarket Street, on which we can see the striking tower of St Michael at the Northgate Church. The tower was built in the year 1040, and is the oldest building you'll find in Oxford, somehow having survived all the action and development in the city over the last 982 years. The church, which still operates today, takes its name from its position by the old Northgate of the city walls here, and once upon a time it was also neighboured by the prison in which the Oxford Martyrs were held after their trial in 1555. Beside the church today is another historic Oxford landmark, a building of the 15th century, which is believed to have originally been the home of 3 shops, but today belongs to Jesus College, yet still retains its purpose as a retail space. As we mentioned, this part of Oxford was the heart of the city's commerce, with Cornmarket Street, as the name suggests, the home of Oxford's corn market. The market took place here from the medieval period, and until 1644, the corn market was covered by a lead roof, which was then demolished to be used for bullets during the English Civil War. However, while the street is a fairly familiar shopping street today, it was once known as Northgate Street, and bisected the city of Oxford between east and west. In the Anglo-Saxon period, what was then Northgate Street was a bustling commercial area, occupying a central position in the lives of Oxford locals plying their trades. However, in the year 1355, the street, and more specifically the Carfax crossroads further along, was the point where one of the great riots of Oxford's history broke out. That was the year of the St Scholastica Day riot, which initially began on the 10th of February as a quarrel at the Swindlestock Tavern on Carfax, when 2 university students complained about the quality of the wine they'd been served. The complaint soon led to a brawl, and many of the tavern's other customers joined in, on the sides of both the students and the locals. This was a flashpoint in the historic town and gown tensions between students and locals, and after beginning as a bar fight, the violence rapidly exploded into 3 days of huge riots, with numerous university halls raided and 93 people being killed in the action. But this wasn't the first time that the tensions between town and gown had erupted into violence. Now at the Carfax crossroads where the St Scholastica Day riots began, it was roughly 150 years beforehand when 2 students were lynched by Oxford locals, an event which outraged many members of the academic community. Fearing more violence directed towards them from locals, a number of Oxford scholars decided to pack up and leave the town, and travelled northeast across the country to the town of Cambridge, where they established a major academic institution. That institution, of course, came to be known as the University of Cambridge, the 2nd oldest university in the English-speaking world. But I should be a little more careful when talking about Oxford's greatest academic competitor while walking through these streets. Such is the long-term rivalry between Oxford and Cambridge, that it's customary not to refer to either by name. Here in Oxford, students like to refer to their rival university as the other place, a name which is of course reciprocated over in the other place. So, despite their legendary rivalry, which you'll no doubt know comes to a head at the annual university boat race on the River Thames in London, Oxford and Cambridge have a history that is deeply intertwined. Moving on now, we find ourselves on Queen Street, another pedestrianised shopping drag that's one of the most modern-looking thoroughfares in Oxford. Originally, this street was the main way that connected Carfax with Oxford Castle, and was in the early medieval era known as the Bailey, owing to its links with the castle. Later on in history, it became the home of Oxford's meat market, gaining the name Butcher Row. However, today the road is known as Queen Street, named after the wife of King George III, Queen Charlotte, who visited Oxford in the year 1785. At this end of Queen Street is the small Bonn Square, named after Oxford's sister city, Bonn, in Germany. Once upon a time, this square was the site of a church graveyard, but went on to become a memorial garden and later city square, on which you can see the Tira Memorial, the first war memorial dedicated in Oxford. Just opposite is the enormous Westgate shopping centre, which was originally opened in 1972, but was massively refurbished in 2017, giving it the striking modern facade we see today. The shopping centre's name also gives us a clue as to what once stood at this part of town, the western gate of the original Anglo-Saxon town walls. These original walls were fairly rudimentary for the size that Oxford became in the following centuries, and the walled area was expanded further to the west here with the building of Oxford Castle, which we'll walk towards now. In fact, just up ahead, you can see the green castle mound, but there are a couple of interesting landmarks here on what's known as New Road that we can look at beforehand. Over on the right of your picture is the library of the university's Nuffield College. With its soaring copper spire, the library is the second tallest structure in Oxford, and is one of a number of buildings that actually exceeds the historic height limit set by Carfax Tower. Closer to us here on the left, meanwhile, is the old Oxfordshire County Hall, which was built in 1841, but designed with a castle-style facade in the spirit of the fortress that once partially occupied this site. The County Hall is still in use for a number of administrative purposes, although a much larger, newer County Hall was opened adjacent to it in 1973. Having passed by the County Hall, we'll now take a left turn towards the remains of Oxford Castle, one of the most significant buildings in the entire city, and which will be the last landmark on our tour of Oxford for today. The castle, which has been beautifully preserved, has a history dating all the way back to the year 1071, but much of it was destroyed during the English Civil War. The damage from the war left the castle unused, and so the site went into use as Oxford's local prison, the building before us here dating from the late 18th century when the prison opened. Oxford Prison remained in operation here all the way until 1996, but is now the home of a hotel, while the castle remains, which in parts also housed inmates, can now be visited and explored by the public. At the time of the castle's construction, it was one of the largest motte and bailey castles in England, and was a dominant presence in early medieval Oxford. Built on the orders of William the Conqueror, the building of the castle swept away a number of old Anglo-Saxon houses, which gave way to the castle's Grand Bailey. The eye-catching buildings that stand before us here on the Bailey actually date from two completely different eras. In the foreground is the 18th century prison debtors' tower. Behind it, meanwhile, is St George's Tower, which once formed part of the walls around Oxford, and is the oldest part of the castle complex, as well as being one of the oldest pieces of military architecture in England. Opposite them both is the Castle Motte, currently being restored, but which was once the most prominent part of Oxford Castle, topped by a wooden tower that overlooked the medieval town. The scale of the castle was a symbol of its strength, and it underwent dramatic conflict through its entire life, including the intense siege of Oxford in 1142, a series of attacks in the First Barons' War roughly 70 years later, and of course, the English Civil War. As we mentioned earlier, King Charles I and the Royalists made Oxford their war capital, and were stationed here from 1642 until 1646. However, the parliamentarians laid siege to the city a number of times over that period, culminating in a 2-month siege in 1646 that saw the parliamentarians finally take control of the king's war capital. The parliamentarians did actually improve the defences here after they captured the castle, but it became mostly used as a prison, with the buildings surrounding us here some of the cell blocks that were built in the 18th century, and which housed thousands of prisoners over the years. Whether in its role as a castle or a prison, this has always been a daunting part of Oxford. But the work by many over the last few years has seen the site transformed into one of the city's most riveting visitor attractions, now allowing you to walk around a point in Oxford that's been closed to the public for the best part of 1,000 years. And for a city with such a long and illustrious history, the fact that there are still new things to see and discover is an absolute joy. Over the course of this long walk around the city, we've only just scratched the surface of Oxford's incredible story, from its world-famous university colleges to its spectacular range of architecture and the many events that shape the city we know today. While Oxford is of course best known around the world for its university, I hope you'll agree that there's even more to the city than that. That brings us to the end of our tour around Oxford. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly hope you're looking forward to visiting Oxford for yourself too.